Good evening, and welcome back. I hope last night's tale didn't haunt you too badly, but if it did, well, I'm afraid this one won't be much kinder. Tonight, I'll take you to a sweltering New York summer afternoon in the year 1928, a time when radios still whined with static, children still played stickball in the streets, and neighbors left their back doors unlocked because, well, monsters were still thought to linger in closets, in children's imaginations, not loiter on front stoops, with fresh strawberries, a bit of cheese, and some fancy spewed lies. It was a time when trust still came easy, and the scariest thing on the block was a thunderstorm rolling in from the Hudson. But in one apartment, on one ordinary street, a door was about to open, and behind it would stand the last monster on Earth you'd want to invite inside. But that's exactly what happened. So come now, grab that cuddle pillow and pull that blanket a little closer to your chin. Let the wind and the rain tend to the rhythm of the night, and lean just a little closer to the fire as we open the first page in tonight's Fireside crime case, the tale of Gracie Budd. New York City was thick and sticky with heat that year. Fans hummed through open windows without cease, or much relief, if truth be known. Whispers of more layoffs down at the pier were complicating the struggle of just getting by, and 25 cents an hour was beginning to take its toll on the middle class. Like everyone on the block, the Budds were feeling the strain. The family lived in a modest apartment, tight quarters, the kind of place where every sound echoed and every dollar was already spent. Laundry hung from lines above the stove. The floor creaked even when no one was walking. Albert and Dahlia Budd were doing the best they could. Two hard-working parents, 5 children, and not nearly enough bread to go around. They lived humbly in the working-class neighborhood of Manhattan, where you counted your blessings, and sometimes your coins. Edward Budd, the oldest, just 18, understood the family's circumstances and wanted desperately to help. He wanted to work. He placed an ad in the New York World newspaper. Simple words: young man, 18, wishes position in country, Edward Budd. He didn't really expect a reply, but one came. Handwritten, careful, signed Frank Howard. Claimed to be a farmer from Farmingdale. Said he needed strong boys to help on his property. Said he'd come meet Edward in person. But this man's name wasn't really Frank Howard, and he didn't really have a farm, didn't even own a shovel. Unfortunately, by the time anyone knew that, it was far too late. The man who promised to call on Edward Budd had had many names over the years, but in truth, he had once been a boy named Hamilton Howard Fish, born in 1870, Washington, D.C., the youngest of 4, a child born slap dab into the midst of madness. His father, 75 years old when Hamilton was born, and his mother, oh my, well, she was 43 years younger than her husband, deeply religious, cold as ice, unforgiving, and unbending. The kind of woman who believed pain was purification and silence was next to godliness. When Hamilton was 5, his father dropped dead in the street, and, without income, without mercy, his mother quickly placed him in an orphanage. That was where the boy first met cruelty, and worse still, where he began to crave it. He wrote later in prison letters, "I was whipped until I bled, and I never cried. I watched the other boys suffer, and I wanted it too." The beatings became routine. The caretakers believed they were saving souls, but for Albert, as he now called himself, every belt across his backside was a haunting whisper, a voice telling him something sacred lived in pain. By 10, he had started punishing himself for pleasure. Pins, needles, a cat-o'-nine-tails made of broomstick and wire. And yet, to those outside, he was quiet, soft-voiced, polite. It was a mask, and over time, it fit so well, even he forgot it was there. Years later, when he sat across from the Budd family, sharing strawberries and cheese, smiling at their little girl, that same voice still lived in him, the one that whispered in the orphanage, the one that taught him to smile while hurting, the one that said, "No one will ever believe it was you." Albert Fish became a man that no one ever remembered clearly, not because he was forgettable, but because he knew exactly how to hide. By 20, he was painting houses and mending fences across New York. Hard work, quiet work. He kept his head down, smiled when spoken to, never raised his voice, never drank. He married, had 6 children, lived in a modest home with worn furniture and neatly folded linens. Neighbors would later say, he seemed strict but gentle. He quoted scripture at the dinner table. He didn't even curse, but the truth was this. Albert Fish led 2 lives. In one, he tucked his children into bed. In the other, he read articles about cannibal tribes in the Philippines and clipped them into a scrapbook marked meat. He wrote anonymous letters to widows, dark letters, suggestive, terrifying. He left raw meat out in the sun and ate it when it crawled. He began visiting brothels and asking the women there to beat him. Sometimes he paid them to let him beat them, but only if they wept. He said later, "I wanted to taste what it was to be God and devil in the same skin." By the time he was 50, his wife had left him. His children had learned to avoid the basement, and the voices he once heard in the orphanage, well, those still remained. They didn't scream, mind you, but they did whisper, relentlessly. But I digress. Where were we? Ah, yes. The knock came late morning. The city buzzed outside. Wagons clattered past. A vendor called out about peaches. Mrs. Budd, a formidable woman whose sheer presence, shall we say, filled the room, wiped the back of her hands on her apron and opened the door. There he stood, small, thin, with a grey mustache and an old pressed suit. Polite, soft-spoken. He removed his hat before entering the apartment. He'd brought strawberries, fresh ones, he'd said, from his garden. He smiled with modest pride, set the basket down gently, told them he'd picked them that very morning. And as the Budd children watched quietly from the corner of the room, he complimented them, asked about their schooling. He stayed for tea, chatted warmly with Mr. Budd about country life. Said he needed Edward and, perhaps, a friend to help mend fences and milk goats. Offered $15 a week, a fortune to that family. Excitement buzzed silently in the cramped kitchen. Edward's simple newspaper ad had brought them hope, and in the form of a soft-spoken old farmer with strawberries and a smile. But then he looked toward the hallway and saw her, 10-year-old Gracie Budd, tiny hands, bright eyes, her hair in ribbons, her shoes unlaced. Mr. Howard stared at the child for a quiet moment. A slow, cynical smile slivered its way across his age-lined face. Asked her name, told her she looked clever, said she looked like someone his wife would adore, said she should visit sometime, perhaps help his wife with sewing on Sundays. Mrs. Budd felt something twist in her gut. She quickly folded her arms across her large aproned waist and prayed silently that no one had seen her moment of cringe. Mr. Howard rose, excusing himself to be about the business of the day, but promised to hire Budd and his friend if he so wished, and said he'd be by to collect them in a few days. Fish failed to show up, but he sent a telegram apologizing for his delay and set a later date. And, unfortunately, Mr. Frank Howard returned. He brought strawberries again, even brought a bit of cheese, spoke kindly words again and sipped slowly on tea. Said his niece was having a birthday party in the country. There'd be balloons, cake, music. Maybe little Gracie would come along, just for a bit of the afternoon. The Budds hesitated, but he was kind, gentle, reminded them of someone safe. Gracie wore her best white dress, kissed her mother's cheek, promised to be home by dinner. Then, as Mrs. Budd watched from the window, Gracie walked out the door with Mr. Frank Howard. That was June 3rd, 1928. Little Gracie Budd never came home. The Budds waited until dark, and then darker still. At first, they believed maybe the farm was farther than he'd said. Maybe they'd stopped somewhere along the way. Maybe she'd walk back in, cheeks red from cake and laughter, still holding a balloon. But by morning, they knew. They went to the police, showed the ad, described the man. Grey moustache, old suit, called himself Frank Howard. The Budds waited for hours. Then, days. The police were kind but slow. They found no records of a Frank Howard in Farmingdale, no niece, no birthday, no farmhouse. The handwriting on his letter was traced. It matched nothing in their records. The man had lied, but it was a gentle lie with soft hands and warm eyes, and that, somehow, made it so much worse. Weeks passed, then months. The Budds put out flyers, sent letters, offered rewards, but Gracie had vanished like mist through their fingers. They prayed, they cried, they waited, and all the while, the man they called Frank Howard moved unnoticed among the shadows of the city. There were no leads, no witnesses, no clues. He had vanished as completely as the child he'd taken. Reporters wrote about it. Whispers traveled through neighborhoods and across backyard fences. And still, nothing. Edward Budd blamed himself. He stopped eating, stopped answering the door. My ad, he said, invited evil into our home. And Gracie's mother, oh my, dear woman. She waited by the window, every day, for years. She never touched strawberries again. She said the smell of them made her stomach turn. Time passed, years in fact, and Gracie Budd became a photograph, framed in black and fading by the window. The Budd family remained where they were, just in case she came home. They never moved, never changed their phone number, never stopped watching from the window. But 6 long years had passed, and Gracie Budd had never returned, until one day she did. Well, in a manner of speaking, I suppose. In November of 1934, an envelope arrived. The handwriting was small, meticulous, tight, like someone trying to keep their secrets small. It was addressed not to Edward, nor to Mr. Budd. It was addressed to Gracie's mother. Inside was a letter. The letter was dated November 11th, 1934. There was no return address, no signature, only pages, stained slightly with age and something darker. The letter began with a soft memory, a childhood story from the writer's own life. But then, word by word, it began to rot. Dear Mrs. Budd, it began. In 1894, A friend of mine shipped as a deckhand on the steamer Tacoma, Captain John Davis. They sailed from San Francisco to Hong Kong. When they arrived, he and 2 others went ashore and got drunk. When they returned, the boat was gone. There was a famine in China. Meat of any kind was from $1 to $3 a pound. All children under 12 were sold to the butchers to be cut up and sold for food. You could go into any shop and ask for steak, cut from the hindquarter of a boy or girl, and it would be brought to you, fresh cut. My friend stayed there so long, he acquired a taste for human flesh. The tone was calm, like it was being recited over tea. The story was disturbing, but not personal. Until the page turned. It began politely, and then descended. Word by word, the knife began to cut. On Sunday, June the 3rd, 1928, I called on you at 406 West 15th Street. Brought you pot cheese, strawberries. We had a bit of lunch and tea. Gracie sat in my lap and kissed me. I made up my mind to eat her then. On the pretense of taking her to a birthday party, you said yes. You let her go. I took her to an empty house in Westchester County I had already picked out. When we got there, I told her to remain outside. She picked wildflowers, hummed to herself, sat on the porch steps, her pretty white dress fanned out around her. He claimed he watched her for a while. Then, when all was ready, I went to the window and called to her, he said. Then I hid in a closet until she was in the room. And then, oh my, forgive me, he described, in clear, horrid detail, exactly what he'd done. He told Mrs. Budd that Gracie had not been harmed until he harmed her. He said that she cried, that he prayed, that he told her he loved her like a daughter. And then he told Mrs. Budd how he'd... Oh my. The rest of the letter, honestly, was so vile, so cruel that it would be, well, wicked of me to recall it here and allow it to seep into your slumber. Just know this. Even the most hardened detectives would later say it felt like reading a nightmare written by the devil himself. The letter closed like a farewell, no signature, just a final line. She died a virgin. Mrs. Budd collapsed. Edward screamed. The letter was handed over to police immediately. That letter was how the Budds finally learned what had happened to their precious little Gracie. That letter, likewise, was the very key they needed to finally capturing Albert Fish. It had no return address, no fingerprints, no envelope seal. But it had one mistake: the stationery. Detectives noticed the faint imprint. New York Private Chauffeurs Benevolent Association. It was an obscure union, small office, but he wasn't a chauffeur. When they followed up on the lead, a janitor confessed to stealing some of the stationery, but said he left it behind at a rooming house at 200 East 52nd Street. The landlady confirmed his story. Said, Mr. Albert Fish had checked out of that room just a few days earlier. She said Fish's son sent him money and he'd asked her to hold the check. Said he'd return soon. Detective King smiled and set himself to waiting in the shadows. No press, no warnings, just two plainclothes men watching and waiting. Then, there he was. Older now, face sagging, hands trembling, but clean. He wore a coat with a frayed collar, carried a folded paper tucked up under his arm. He looked, by all accounts, like someone's grandfather. When they asked if he was Frank Howard, he smiled, said no. They gave another name, then another, But when they asked again, "Albert Fish?" he simply said, "I knew you'd come eventually." Detective King stepped toward the old man. Albert quickly reached into his coat. The officer tensed. Albert pulled out a straight razor and prepared to lunge. King quickly and quite frankly with ease wrestled the weapon from the old man's hand. He cuffed him. With no resistance, Albert Fish moved with the detective. He had only one concern. Did they get the letter? At first, he was quiet in custody, polite even. But his story, when it came, didn't spill out. It oozed. He confessed freely, spoke for hours in fact, described the house, the plan, the preparations, said he intended to gain and kill Edward Budd, and maybe the friend, but not the girl. But this was okay, he said. The voice in his head had told him so. He said he wept while he did it, said he cooked her with onions, and when they asked how many others, he paused, then smiled. "I have children in every state," he said. "Some I buried, some I cooked, some I never finished." They pressed for names. "No one remembers them but me," he said, "and God." The courtroom smelled of old paper and cold fear. It smelled of disbelief, of rot, of something the human mind wasn't quite built to house. The trial of Albert Fish, the Grey Man, began on March 11th, 1935, White Plains, New York. The man seated at the defendant's table didn't look like a monster. He looked like a frail grandfather, stooped, pale, with folded hands and soft eyes. But on the table beside him lay the letter and the x-rays. The prosecution brought the jury's attention to his past, the confessions, the letter, and something else. They showed radiographs of his pelvis, 29 needles, all embedded in the soft tissue around his abdomen and groin, rusting, fused to bone, driven in over years, by his own hand. One of the doctors said, some of them were 1.5 inches long. They must have hurt like hell going in, but Albert Fish didn't wince. In fact, he smiled, ever so slightly. The defense pleaded insanity. They said no sane man would do such things, that he was hearing voices, that he believed he was fulfilling a biblical sacrifice, that the pain, the cannibalism wasn't evil, just madness. The prosecution disagreed. They said insanity doesn't plan, insanity doesn't pick aliases, it doesn't write cover letters, hide knives, fake farms, and mail horror by hand. Insanity doesn't make you calculated, evil does. 10 days. That's how long the jury deliberated. Some argued, some wept. One juror would later say, "We felt like we were deciding something for God." But on the 10th day, they came back, sane, guilty, and sentenced to death by electric chair. When they read the verdict, Albert Fish didn't blink. He bowed his head slightly and whispered, "What a thrill that will be." Sing Sing Prison, Ossining, New York, January 16th, 1936. It was snowing lightly that night. The Hudson River lay dark and still behind the walls. Inside, the corridors were quiet. Even the guards were hushed. Albert Fish had spent the evening writing letters. He refused visitors. He requested a modest final meal: boiled potatoes, bacon, a cup of tea. He was calm, even cheerful, smiled when the chaplain entered, told one guard, "I've had a wonderful life." At 11 p.m, they led him down the corridor, his thin frame draped in brown clothes, his steps slow but steady. He entered the chamber with no resistance, sat in the chair like it was a church pew, folded his hands. whispered something to himself. They strapped him down, arms, legs, chest, head, then placed the metal cap across his skull. Under it, a wet sponge to conduct the current. Just before the switch was thrown, a guard asked if he had any last words. Albert smiled. "I don't even know why I'm here." The switch was pulled, and the room lit up. But then, something unexpected. The chair sparked violently. Smoke curled from his lap. The leather straps snapped taut. One witness shouted. Later, an electrician said, "The needles in his body, they disrupted the current, made it surge. It took 2 full jolts and 3 minutes before Albert Fish was declared dead." Reporters would later describe his face as eerily serene, as if he had finally found peace in the very pain he'd always worshipped. They buried him in an unmarked grave behind the prison walls. No mourners, no flowers, no name. But not everyone forgot. Will you? Thank you for listening. This has been Fireside Crime Stories, where the darkest tales are always read by Firelight. If you haven't already, subscribe. And before you drift off, give the fire a little fuel. Tap that like button. Then hit the bell so you'll know exactly when another storm's brewing, when the fire's been lit, and when another story starts seeping from the shadows. Still with me, I see. Wonderful. I was just about to add another log to the fire. Seems a storm's beginning to whisper again. That's all right. Gives us just enough time to slip into Chicago, Illinois, 1976. Seems someone's missing. Again. And the clown in town just might know why. So snuggle up, Buttercup. This one might leave a footprint on your soul. The kind that doesn't wash off in the morning light. Because sometimes the monsters don't hide in basements. Sometimes they build them. The name John Wayne Gacy is infamous around the world. Just speaking the name aloud curdles the spine of history. A man whose crimes were so vile, so calculated, that even now his shadow lingers in our nightmares. Between 1972 and 1978, he raped, tortured, and murdered 33 young men and boys. And, if whispers are to be believed, there were more, but none of it, not a single grave, should have ever been allowed to happen, and I'm about to tell you why. But first, let's go back, as we always do, to the beginning, where the fire first caught the kindling. John was born in 1942 on Chicago's South Side, the second of 3 children, in a home where love was silent and pain did all the talking. His father drank hard and hit even harder, said his son was soft, sickly, weak, a mama's boy. And John, well, he tried. Oh, how he tried. That craving for approval clung to him like a second skin, one he'd never quite shed, no matter how deep he dug into himself. By 17, he'd stumbled through 4 different high schools, never finished a one. So he packed up what little pride he had and headed west, Las Vegas. There he found work at a mortuary, graveyard shift, silent halls, polished marble, and death. It was there, in that chilled formal hush, that something in John Wayne Gacy sprang to life. A body, young, male, perfectly still. He felt it. Arousal. Not at the life that once was, but at the stillness, the silence, the deadness. And so, one night, John crawled into the casket, laid himself beside the corpse, held it, stroked it, pressed against it, like a lover. He embraced the moment and was promptly fired for, well, embracing the moment, I suppose, but he didn't matter. It was too late. The demon had been freed, and that particular kind of hunger, well, you don't just walk away from that. And this wouldn't be the last time John Wayne Gacy would lay with the dead. It would simply be the first. This would become a reoccurring trait that he would adopt over the years of murder and mayhem that were, as yet, still many years out in front of him. Back in Chicago, John dusted himself off, took business courses, learned how to talk clean, smile wide, could sell you anything, a couch, a dream, a lie. And he was good at it. Maybe too good. Promotions followed him like shadows, so did charm. And soon, so did a wife. They moved to Iowa, managed a family-owned chicken restaurant, white picket life, respectable, reliable. On the surface, he was golden. Neighbors liked him, the Chamber of Commerce liked him, hell, even the Rotary Club liked him. But darkness doesn't stay buried long. In 1968, it spilled over. John was arrested, charged with luring a young boy into a nightmare. He pleaded guilty. Sodomy. Oh my. 10 years, they said. 10 years. And John? He was a model prisoner, cooked for the warden, organized events, smiled for everyone. And his wife? She divorced him. Good for her. Still, John only served 18 months of that 10-year sentence. And I want you to remember that fact, that number, because it's going to matter before this tale is through. But I digress. When the gates opened, John walked free, colder, sharper, smarter. And he had a new rule now, etched deep in the marrow of his mind. Leave no witnesses. By 1971, he was remarried, back in Chicago, funded by his mother. He launched his own business, PDM Contractors. It paid well, demanded long hours, and hired cheap labor, teenage boys, young men, fresh faces with rough hands and no real paper trail. That same year, another boy came forward, said Gacy tried to rape him. But the kid didn't show up to court. The charges disappeared, and apparently, so did the warning signs. But John remembered. He had dismissed Rule 1, silly boy. He learned this time around though, and he never made that mistake again. He wore many faces now. The tireless businessman, the neighborhood clown, the Democratic precinct captain who once shook hands with First Lady Rosalind Carter. He painted smiles on his cheeks, red, white, blue, called himself Pogo, and handed out balloons to children in cancer wards with a grin wide enough to swallow them whole. Behind the face paint, the charm, the growing business. John said he just wanted to leave his mark on the world, and he did. Trust me, he did. To the neighbors on Summerdale Avenue, John's life looked polished. A house, a wife, a business, balloons and barbecues, Pogo the clown dancing with sick children, a man made of good intentions. But behind closed doors, well, things were different. John's second wife would later say he'd become moody, obsessive, unpredictable in ways that scraped the edges of sanity. He ranted, slammed cabinets, disappeared at odd hours, And then there were the magazines, piles of them. Male models, teenage boys, shadows printed in slick ink that stared at her long after the lights went out. One night he told her the truth, or at least his version of it. Said he didn't want her anymore. Not like that. Said his preferences were younger now. Had been for a while. Teenage boys, that was his taste. That was his truth. And she, God help her, said nothing. Not to a priest. Not to a friend. Not to the police. She said nothing. And I know, it's not kind to judge the frightened. But sweet mercy, after prison, after sodomy charges, after it all, she should have told someone. In 1976, she finally asked for a divorce, packed her things, walked away. And John? He didn't protest, didn't cry, didn't threaten. Because by then, he didn't need her anymore. His secret life was in full bloom. By the time she closed the door for good, 2 bodies were already buried beneath the floorboards of their happy little home. And John, he already had his eye on the next one. From the outside, it still looked like a life. A contractor's truck, an American flag snapping on the porch, neighbors waving at the man in the yard, the one in overalls with the too wide smile, the one who passed out cokes to boys in paint-smeared jeans. By 1976, 2 bodies were already in the dirt, out by the garage, buried quiet beneath the scent of gasoline and dry leaves. They'd come for work, for cash, for a little dignity, just boys. No one remembered their names. Not past the first handshake, not past the sign-in sheet. And then the rhythm began, slow, deliberate, like a heartbeat on the edge of sleep. One by one, they vanished. Kenneth Parker, 16, last seen October 24th. Michael Marino, 14, too young to die. Frank Landingen, 19, fished from the Des Plaines River, his hands still bound. Then came Gregory Godzik. He'd just started with Gacy, told his parents the guy was a bit odd, but paid in cash. December 12th, 1976. He didn't come home. They passed through Gacy's hands, one after another. And once they passed through, they never passed back. 33 of them. Oh my, maybe more. Sons, brothers, good kids, the kind who mowed lawns, called their mums after work, borrowed their dad's tools. And the man they trusted, well, he could erase a name like chalk under cold rain. He kept a calendar of them, dates marked not with ink but with shallow graves, each tick a secret, each boy a ghost. And the city, it never looked twice. Not the neighbors, not the cops, not even some parents, until it was far too late. It wasn't until December of '78 that the mask finally cracked. A boy named Robert Peast vanished after his shift at the local pharmacy. Just 15, bright, polite, reliable. He said he had a job lead, some contractor, paid well. Said he'd be right back. He wasn't. The last man seen with him, John Wayne Gacy, the neighborhood clown. The cops ran his name. What came back chilled them to their bones. A sex offender, a liar, a man who had already slipped through the cracks, obviously way too many times. December 13th, they stepped into his house, The smell, oh my, it was wrong, sweet and rotten, like something reaching from beneath the floorboards. But they had no proof, no body, no cause, so they left. But the silence didn't hold for long. A ring was found, then a map, then a warrant. December 22nd, 1978. Gacy confessed. 33 boys, 33 sons, 33 names he could barely remember. He drew them a map, 28 shallow graves beneath the house, beneath the garage, stacked like secrets in the dirt. The other 5, oh, he had tossed them in the river, said he'd simply run out of room. He told detectives there were 4 Johns inside him, the contractor, the clown, the politician, and the one he called Jack Hanley. Jack, he said. Jack was the one who tricked them, raped them, tortured them for hours, held them under until the light left their eyes, and then laid beside them until he couldn't anymore. The trial began in February of 1980. Over 100 witnesses took the stand. The defense pled insanity, but the jury, well, they didn't blink. Sane, guilty, all 33 counts. Sentenced to death. Gacy didn't cry, didn't beg, didn't say the names. For 14 years, he sat in Menard prison, read every book about himself, counted every article, every screenplay, every line of fame like it was a trophy. He told the press, "I have no ego," then recited his legacy like a king tallying coins. On May 9, 1994, John Wayne Gacy ate his last meal: fried chicken, French fries, Coca-Cola, and strawberry shortcake. He was chatty, smirking. Then, at 12:58 a.m., the 10th of May, after 7 years of killing and attacks against these boys, these children, far too wicked for me to release into your dreams, John Wayne Gacy died by lethal injection. After the needle stilled and John Wayne Gacy breathed no more, his body didn't go straight to the fire. No, first, they cracked open his skull. For 600 hours, teams of specialists studied his brain, looking for the dark rot, the faulty wiring, the twisted knob that could explain it all. But nothing. No tumor, no trauma, no excuse. The killer clown, that painted, preening predator, was just a man. He knew what he was doing. And he did it because he wanted to. That's the horror of John Wayne Gacy. Not madness, not disorder, but choice. His brain now sits in a plastic bag, sealed tight, like a cursed relic, a grim souvenir of how little we truly know about the monsters who look like men. But oh, we're not done just yet, are we? Let's rewind. Back to 1968. John had married into money. His wife's family owned a string of Kentucky Fried Chicken franchises, and he was the golden boy, managing stores, hosting parties, shaking hands at community fundraisers while holding boys behind closed doors. He fathered 2 children, even as he seduced the teenage boys who worked for him. On the very night his wife gave birth to their son, John was in his car, luring a boy into the dark. He was promptly arrested, pled guilty to sodomy, sentenced to 10 years. 10 years. But he served only 18 months. Let that sink in. 10 years whittled down to 1.5 because he cooked well, followed rules, smiled for the guards, and when he walked out those prison gates in early 1971, he wasted no time. That same year, the same year, mind you, he was accused again, attempted rape, but the boy didn't show. The case was dropped, the warning lost, and from that silence, 33 more would follow. Think about it. If John Wayne Gacy had served his original full sentence, he would have been released in 1978, the very year he was arrested for 33 murders. Had the system done what it should have just once, those boys would still be here. And his second wife? She knew. He told her, flat out, said he only wanted boys, teenagers, and she said, nothing. 2 of those missing boys, 2 trusting souls who worked for her husband, were already gone. And she knew it. She just didn't know they were buried underneath her feet, under the garage, under the porch, under the very foundation of the life she thought she had. Oh my. You want to know what made Gacy a monster? Nothing. He wasn't broken. He wasn't mad. He was just a man, with power, with opportunity, with no one who stopped him when they had the chance. And maybe that's the most chilling thing of all. Well now, the storm has quieted and the fire burns low. But the echoes of tonight's tales, well, I can't promise they won't follow you down empty hallways or into your dreams. But for now, sleep well, if you can. Until next time, we'll keep the fire burning.